It was a quiet Charleston afternoon, sunlight spilling across manicured lawns, the kind of day when nothing bad ever seems possible. Inside the Mitchell family's brick home, laughter filled the living room. Two little boys played superheroes while their mother, Sophia, filmed their joy. Just 4 minutes later, that same room became a crime scene. The shooter wasn't a stranger breaking in from the shadows. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who had been part of their family dinners, their birthdays, their memories. When police arrived, what they found defied logic. A mother and her 2 young sons, all shot in the head, and a teenage girl standing at the center of it all. What could drive a 17-year-old to destroy her own family? And why did the clues, from cell data to chilling journal entries, reveal a darkness far deeper than anyone imagined? This is the story of Ashley Callison and the murders that shattered a family forever. Before we dive into this disturbing case, take a moment to support our work. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this documentary with others who follow true crime stories that uncover not just what happened, but why it happened. Your support helps us keep exploring the untold truths behind cases like this one. Stories that are as haunting as they are human. Charleston, South Carolina, a city that carries its history like perfume, soft and familiar, where cobblestone streets and swaying oaks tell stories of peace and permanence. In a quiet suburban corner of this old city stood the Mitchell family home, red brick, trimmed hedges, and a white porch swing that never stopped moving when the afternoon breeze came through. To neighbors, the Mitchells were everything right about small city life. David Mitchell, 36, was a reliable professional, polite, helpful, always the first to offer a hand with a fence repair or school fundraiser. His wife, Sophia, 32, was the heart of the household, a former kindergarten teacher who had given up her classroom to raise their 2 boys, 5-year-old Liam and 3-year-old Noah. She was gentle, creative, endlessly patient, the kind of mother who turned grocery runs into adventures and rainy days into art lessons. Their home pulsed with the simple rhythm of family life, cartoons in the morning, laughter in the evening, the quiet sound of love made ordinary through routine. On March 14, 2022, that rhythm played out one last time. David left early for work, kissing Sophia goodbye at the door, promising to be home for dinner. Sophia's day unfolded in the soft predictability of motherhood, dropping Liam at preschool, running errands with Noah, stopping for coffee at the local cafe where everyone knew her name. By early afternoon, she was back home, sunlight spilling through the blinds as the boys played superheroes in the living room. At 2:43 p.m., she sent David a short video, the kind every parent records without a second thought. Liam was crouched over a tower of colorful blocks, explaining his design while Noah, dressed head to toe in his Captain America costume, spun circles beside him, giggling. Behind the camera, Sophia's voice glowed with affection. "Show Daddy your tower, Liam." It was a snapshot of pure domestic joy, and heartbreakingly the final moments of it. At 2:15 p.m., a red hatchback had pulled quietly into the driveway, captured by a neighbor's door camera. It belonged to 17-year-old Ashley Callison, David's younger sister. She'd been to the house countless times, a trusted presence who babysat the boys and joined them for birthdays and holidays. So when she knocked on the back door that afternoon, Sophia would have welcomed her in without hesitation. What happened next unfolded in less than 5 minutes. Between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m., 3 gunshots shattered the silence. They were sharp, deliberate, and final. Neighbors later said they thought it was construction or fireworks. In a neighborhood that quiet, tragedy didn't fit. Inside the house, Sophia was shot once in the back of the head while sitting on the sofa. No defensive wounds, no time to react. Liam was struck as he ran toward the hallway, a child's instinct to flee. Noah, still in costume, tried to hide behind an armchair. The bullet found him there. The murder weapon was a 9mm handgun registered to David, kept in a locked safe upstairs. The safe showed no signs of damage. The combination had been entered correctly. The killer hadn't forced their way in. They'd known exactly where to go and what to do. At 3:17 p.m., David's phone rang. The name on the screen read Ashley. Her voice was trembling, panicked. "David, something's wrong. I went to see Sophia and the boys. I think someone broke in. They're hurt. Please, come home." He didn't hesitate. He dropped everything, bolted from his office, calling Sophia again and again as he drove. 7 unanswered calls in 4 minutes. By 3:21, he was on the line with 911, his voice cracking between disbelief and dread. "My sister says my wife and kids are hurt. There was an intruder. Please send someone now." Police reached the Mitchell home at 3:28 p.m. The back door was unlocked. The house was still, toys scattered, the television humming quietly, sunlight pouring through the blinds onto a floor now marked by tragedy. Officers found Sophia on the sofa, Liam near the hallway, Noah behind the chair, each killed with a single shot. No forced entry, no theft, just deliberate death. Moments later, David's car screeched to a stop outside. He tried to run past the police tape, shouting their names, collapsing when they held him back. His cries echoed down the street as dusk fell over Charleston, a sound that neighbors would never forget. By nightfall, flashing lights bathed the quiet block in red and blue, and detectives were already whispering the thought none dared to say aloud. This wasn't a random break-in. Whoever had done this knew the family, the home, and the code to the gun safe. The investigation began under the fading light of that same evening, when the once bright Mitchell home had transformed into a landscape of flashing lights, camera tripods, and quiet murmurs. Detectives moved through the scene with deliberate care, documenting everything from the position of each body to the faint scent of gunpowder that still lingered in the air. It was a textbook crime scene in terms of precision, but that very neatness made it unnerving. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of a break-in, no smashed windows, no forced locks. The family's valuables, jewelry, wallets, electronics, all untouched. Everything about the scene suggested intent rather than chaos. The shooter had moved with calm, methodical precision. And yet, one object drew particular attention. The handgun resting on the living room coffee table, beside a half-empty cup of juice. It was David's weapon, wiped clean, but not hidden. For veteran detectives like Ryan Cooper, the lead investigator, such details screamed of confidence or arrogance. Whoever had done this hadn't worried about being caught. Ashley Callison arrived at the police station later that evening, accompanied by her mother. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from what appeared to be hours of crying. She told investigators she had gone to visit Sophia and the boys that afternoon, something she did occasionally when school let out early. When she knocked and no one answered, she said she tried the back door and found it unlocked. Inside, she claimed, she heard a noise, like someone moving upstairs, and then 3 loud pops that sent her running. Her story sounded rehearsed, almost too neat, but she was 17, scared, traumatized, and seemingly genuine in her distress. Still, some details bothered Detective Cooper. For one, the timeline didn't make sense. According to phone data, Ashley had called David at 3:17 p.m., nearly 30 minutes after the estimated time of death. Why would she wait that long to report hearing gunfire? And why, if she had truly seen something horrific, were there no traces of blood or gunshot residue on her clothes? The inconsistencies hung heavy in the air, but in the early hours, suspicion remained cautious. This was family, after all. The next morning, as forensic teams began analyzing the evidence, the contradictions deepened. The family gun safe showed no signs of tampering. The combination had been entered properly, not guessed or forced. Only 2 people knew that code: David and Ashley. He had shared it with her years earlier when she babysat, in case she ever needed protection during a late-night shift. At the time, it was an act of trust. Now, it was a key piece of evidence. Ballistic testing confirmed that the 9mm found at the scene had fired all 3 bullets that killed Sophia and the boys. Fingerprint analysis revealed partial prints on the gun, smudged, but enough to show they belonged to someone with small hands. Ashley's explanation for her presence in the house began to crumble. When pressed, she shifted her story. She said she thought she saw someone running out the front door as she entered, but could offer no description. She said she'd called David immediately after leaving, though her phone records said otherwise. Her words tangled under the weight of the facts. By mid-afternoon, what had first sounded like a tragedy involving a faceless intruder began to look like something far more intimate and far more disturbing. Detectives returned to the Mitchell home that evening, replaying the crime scene in their minds. The position of the bodies told a story, one of familiarity and trust. Sophia had been shot from close range, likely while seated, facing away from her killer. There was no struggle, no defensive wound. She had never felt threatened until the final moment. Liam's body placement suggested motion. He had been running, and Noah, still wearing his Captain America costume, had been crouched low, hiding behind the chair. For investigators, these details painted a chilling picture. The killer wasn't driven by impulse or rage. It was someone who moved through that home quietly, purposefully, perhaps even with affection before turning violent. And that kind of crime rarely comes from outside the family. Back at the station, Detective Cooper reviewed Ashley's interviews again. Her emotional outbursts felt staged, tears that came too easily and stopped too abruptly. When she was asked to recount the order of events, her answers drifted, her timing inconsistent. One moment she claimed to have seen Sophia alive. The next, she said she only heard gunshots. Still, she insisted she loved them, that she could never hurt them. But as the hours passed, her calm began to crack. She started asking strange questions, whether David had seen the video Sophia sent him, whether the police knew how long she'd been at the house, whether they were sure the back door had been unlocked. Each question sounded less like fear and more like calculation. By the end of that week, the investigation had shifted completely. What began as a search for a faceless intruder had narrowed to a single devastating suspect: the family's own teenage daughter and sister. The evidence, forensic, digital, behavioral, was beginning to converge around Ashley Callison. Detectives now believed that her 317 phone call was not a panicked report of a discovery, but an attempt to control the story before it reached anyone else. Surveillance footage placed her car in the driveway far longer than she'd claimed. Her phone location data showed no sign of her ever leaving in panic, and traces of gunshot residue were later found on the sleeve of the sweatshirt she'd worn that day. But beyond the evidence lay the question that haunted everyone who touched the case. Why? What could drive a 17-year-old girl to execute the family that had loved her, the children who adored her? That question would not be answered quickly, and as Charleston tried to process the unthinkable, investigators prepared to peel back the layers of Ashley's life, a life that, behind the polite smiles and school portraits, hid a darkness few had seen coming. When the 911 line connected, the sound that came through wasn't just panic, it was heartbreak in real time. "My sister just called me," David Mitchell gasped, his voice tight, uneven, barely holding shape. "She says my wife and kids are hurt. There was an intruder. Please send someone." The dispatcher on the other end could hear him breathing hard, the rhythm of his panic echoing against the low hum of tires on asphalt. David was driving fast, too fast, trying to reach his home before his mind could accept the thought that something had happened to Sophia and the boys. His words kept breaking, trembling, looping through fragments of disbelief. "There's been a mistake. I'm sure it's a mistake." But in his gut, he already knew. The drive that normally took 20 minutes was a blur of red lights and screeching turns, and when he turned onto his street, When he saw the flashing lights, the line of squad cars, and the yellow tape cutting across his front yard, he understood without anyone needing to say it. The world had collapsed. The moment was captured in part by the body cameras of the first responders. The footage is difficult to watch, even for investigators hardened by decades of experience. You see David's car stop abruptly, the door swing open, and then him, frantic, shouting, trying to break through the police line. "That's my house," he screams. "My family's inside. Please, let me through." His voice cracks on the word family. The officers restrain him gently at first, then more firmly as he struggles to reach the front steps. It takes two men to steady him as the reality hits. His knees buckle. His voice dissolves into a sound that isn't quite a scream, not quite a sob, something raw and wordless that shakes everyone around him. Across the street, a few neighbors have gathered, silent, frozen. One of them, 70-year-old Margaret Thompson, breaks away from the crowd and runs toward him. She doesn't say anything profound, just wraps her arms around him and whispers, "They're gone, sweetheart. They're with God now." Later, when she was asked why she stepped forward, she said, "Because no one should ever fall alone like that." Inside the house, officers were still processing the scene when David's breakdown unfolded outside. The home was eerily still, toys scattered where the boys had been playing, sunlight spilling through blinds, the smell of gunpowder faint but unmistakable. A phone lay on the sofa. Sophia's phone, screen still lit with the timestamp of the last message she had sent to her husband. A juice box sat upright on the coffee table beside the family's gun, wiped clean but left in plain sight. It was as though the killer wanted the weapon to be found. Nothing in the house had been taken or disturbed. Everything remained painfully normal, right down to the half-folded laundry on the armchair. Detectives moved slowly, documenting every inch of the room, but even then, something about the scene felt too composed. Crimes of passion leave chaos. This looked like control. Every small detail pointed toward calculation, not panic. Whoever had done this knew the family's routines, their spaces, their safety. And outside, that family's sole survivor was coming apart under the same Charleston sun that had, just hours earlier, lit up Sophia's laughter on video. By the time David was allowed to speak to detectives later that night, his voice was barely audible. They found him seated in the back of a patrol car, hands clasped tight, staring out the window at the flashing lights that danced against the front of his house. When Detective Ryan Cooper crouched beside him, he asked softly, "Mr. Mitchell, is there anyone who would want to hurt your family?" David's eyes didn't move from the window. "No," he whispered. "Nobody." Then, after a pause, he added, "Ashley called me. She said there was an intruder." The detective nodded, but even as David spoke, the seeds of doubt were forming. Nothing about the case so far suggested a random act. The lack of forced entry, the precision of the shots, the open safe, all of it spoke of familiarity. Cooper made a note in his pad but didn't press further. Not yet. It was too soon. Too raw. Outside, the house glowed under floodlights, a crime scene now frozen in photographs and evidence markers. Inside, a picture-perfect family had been wiped from existence, and standing just beyond the tape, the young woman who had placed the call, Ashley Callison, watched the investigation unfold, her tear-streaked face turned toward the cameras, her expression unreadable. In the hours after the crime, the Charleston Police Department worked in silence broken only by the clicking of cameras and the faint hum of radios. While forensic technicians combed through the Mitchell home, detectives turned their focus to the one person who might have answers, 17-year-old Ashley Callison. When she arrived at the precinct that evening, escorted by her mother, she looked small against the sterile walls of the interview room. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of water. On the surface, she seemed like a frightened girl caught in something far bigger than herself. She told investigators that she had stopped by the house around 2:30 that afternoon, something she did often just to visit Sophia and the boys. When she arrived, she said, the house was quiet, the back door unlocked. She claimed she heard a strange noise from inside, footsteps maybe, and then 3 sharp bangs that sent her running. Her story came out in broken pieces, interrupted by sobs. "I didn't go back," she said. "I was scared. I called David once I got in my car." On paper, her account sounded tragic, but plausible. A teenager stumbling upon horror. But even then, detectives could sense something off. Detective Ryan Cooper watched her carefully through the glass as his partner conducted the interview. He'd seen enough trauma victims to know how fear usually looked: disoriented, shaky, grasping for details. But Ashley's fear seemed rehearsed, almost too measured. She cried, but the tears came on cue. Her breathing slowed when the questions grew specific, her tone flattened whenever the focus shifted to the victims. And then there was the matter of timing. According to phone data, Ashley had called David at 3:17 p.m. The shooting, based on forensic analysis, had taken place closer to 2:46. That meant there was a 30-minute window where she was unaccounted for, a lifetime in investigative terms. When Cooper asked what she had done during that gap, Ashley hesitated. "I don't remember," she said softly. "I think I drove around. I was panicking." Her phone's GPS data, however, would later show that her car hadn't left the neighborhood at all. It had sat parked in the Mitchell driveway for over 20 minutes after the last gunshot was fired. That contradiction, between her story and the evidence, was the first crack in the image of the scared, innocent sister. While Ashley was being questioned downtown, David sat in another room, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes empty. He had answered every question the detectives asked, his responses mechanical, his mind elsewhere. He told them he had no enemies, that Sophia was loved by everyone, that their marriage had been solid. When the conversation turned to his sister, he hesitated. "She was close to the kids," he said finally. "They adored her." His voice faltered as he remembered the last call. The way Ashley's tone had been panicked, but strangely composed. "She didn't sound like she'd just seen something horrible," he said quietly. "She sounded prepared." It was a small observation, but it lingered with Detective Cooper. Later that night, when Cooper replayed the 911 recording in his office, the detail gnawed at him. If Ashley had really run from the house in fear, why hadn't she called 911 herself? Why wait to call David, the person most likely to believe her, instead of authorities? In homicide work, details like that weren't coincidences. They were tells. As dawn broke the next morning, Charleston was still reeling from the news. Candlelight vigils began forming at the end of the Mitchell's street. Teddy bears, flowers, handwritten cards from neighbors who couldn't understand how something so evil could touch a family so kind. Reporters spoke of home invasions, random violence, the tragedy of innocence lost. But inside the precinct, detectives were beginning to see a different story emerging, one far darker and more intimate. Forensics confirmed that the gun found at the scene had been fired 3 times, each bullet consistent with close-range execution. There were no defensive wounds, no struggle, no fingerprints other than the victim's and faint smudges that matched Ashley's partial prints. The safe in the master bedroom had been opened using the correct combination. No damage, no forced entry. David confirmed only 2 people knew that code, himself and Ashley. When officers searched her car, they found a pair of latex gloves tucked in the glove box and a sweatshirt with faint traces of gunpowder residue around the sleeves. Ashley's expression when confronted with this evidence shifted from fear to confusion, and then to something colder. "You think I did this?" she whispered, her voice low, flat, detached. Detective Cooper didn't answer. He didn't need to. By the end of that second day, what had begun as a story of a family destroyed by an unknown intruder had begun to change shape entirely. The intruder, it seemed, had never existed. The killer had been someone welcomed through the door, someone trusted, someone loved. Detectives didn't move to arrest Ashley immediately. Not yet. They needed the case airtight, every piece of evidence aligned, every timeline confirmed. But as the sun set over Charleston that night, one quiet truth had already settled in the minds of everyone involved. The enemy wasn't outside the Mitchell home. She had been sitting in their living room, smiling, laughing, playing with the children, and somewhere inside her, something had broken. For David Mitchell, that truth was still unthinkable. He sat alone in the empty house that evening, staring at the family photos lining the mantel. Sophia holding Noah, Liam on his shoulders, Ashley standing beside them, smiling. He didn't yet know what investigators suspected. He only knew that his life, his family, his future had all ended with a single phone call from his sister. By the third day of the investigation, the phrase home invasion had all but vanished from the detective's vocabulary. What had once been treated as a random act of violence was now being dissected with surgical precision, and each new piece of evidence drew the circle of suspicion tighter around 17-year-old Ashley Callison. Inside the Charleston Police Department's glass-walled conference room, detectives gathered in silence as photographs from the crime scene glowed on the projector. The gun on the coffee table, the open safe, the video Sophia had sent to her husband minutes before her death. Every image spoke of trust, the trust of a mother who opened her door to someone she loved, unaware that she was welcoming in her own killer. Detective Ryan Cooper stood at the head of the room, his voice low but resolute. "This wasn't an intruder," he said. "This was someone who knew where the gun was, who knew the house, and who knew exactly what they were doing." No one disagreed. There was too much that didn't fit the story Ashley had given them. Too many gaps that only a deliberate lie could explain. Forensic analysis had started to fill those gaps. Ashley's clothing, collected the night of the murders, revealed faint traces of gunshot residue along the cuffs of her sweatshirt. Her car, still parked at her mother's house, contained a single shell casing under the passenger seat, a match to the ammunition used in the Mitchell killings. Ballistics confirmed the fatal bullets were fired from David's 9mm handgun, and the prints on that gun, though smudged, bore the same pattern as Ashley's partials. When confronted with this information, Ashley's responses began to change. In her second interview, she appeared more composed, almost detached. Gone was the frantic, trembling teenager from the night before. In her place sat someone quieter, sharper, and oddly calm. She told detectives she had handled the gun weeks earlier during target practice, explaining the residue and fingerprints. But there was no record of such an event, and the explanation rang hollow. Her mother, sitting in on the interview, looked stunned, as if realizing for the first time that her daughter's words were starting to sound like a story rather than the truth. Detective Cooper and his team began to reconstruct the afternoon of March 14th, minute by minute. Cell tower pings placed Ashley's phone at the Mitchell home from 2:15 to 3:05 p.m., nearly 50 minutes. Yet she had told police she fled within seconds of hearing the shots. The video Sophia sent to David at 2:43 provided a time-stamped glimpse into a world still intact. The children laughing, the living room untouched. That meant the murders occurred sometime after 2:43, narrowing the window to just minutes before Ashley's departure. Investigators cross-referenced Ashley's location data with the neighbor's surveillance footage and discovered another lie. The red hatchback had never left the driveway during the time Ashley claimed she was driving around in panic. Instead, the car's headlights flashed briefly at 3:11, then went dark again. The moment detectives now believe she sat inside rehearsing what she would say. By the time she called David at 3:17, her voice trembling with fabricated terror, Her family was already gone. The more they examined her version of events, the clearer it became that the intruder she described existed only as a mask, a convenient ghost behind which she could hide her guilt. Outside the world of police tape and lab results, Charleston was spinning with grief and speculation. News stations called it the Mitchell family murders. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about the poor girl who had discovered the bodies, unaware of how close she was to becoming the prime suspect. Candlelight vigils filled the street with flickering warmth. But behind those flames was confusion. How could something like this happen here? David, meanwhile, lived in a state beyond comprehension. He moved mechanically through the days, his voice barely rising above a whisper. When detectives updated him on the progress of the case, they avoided mentioning Ashley directly. He clung to her innocence the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. "She's just a kid," he told them. "She wouldn't hurt anyone." But even as he spoke, he began replaying that phone call in his mind, searching for signs he'd missed. The hesitation in her tone, the way she said, "They're hurt," instead of, "They're gone." Little details that only hindsight could turn into alarm bells. The pieces were aligning faster than anyone expected, and each one pointed to the same devastating truth. There had never been an intruder at all. As the investigation deepened, the fragile facade Ashley had built began to crumble under the weight of evidence. Each new discovery stripped away another layer of her story until there was almost nothing left but silence. Detectives learned that earlier that same week, Ashley had accessed David's gun safe while visiting the house under the pretense of borrowing a jacket from the bedroom closet. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's outdoor camera showed her entering through the back door around noon and leaving 20 minutes later, a visit she had never mentioned. Forensic specialists dusted the safe and confirmed her fingerprints on the dial, fresher than any others, suggesting she had opened it recently. It was a chilling revelation. The weapon hadn't been taken in panic, but planned and retrieved with purpose. When this evidence was presented during her third interview, Ashley stared at the table for a long moment, then muttered, "I don't remember." But her posture told a different story. Shoulders stiff, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. It wasn't the posture of someone recalling trauma. It was the stance of someone cornered. Investigators also turned to digital evidence, a realm that, unlike people, rarely lies. Forensic technicians recovered deleted search history from Ashley's phone, revealing searches like "How to unlock a gun safe," "Can fingerprints be washed off a gun," and "How long does GSR stay on skin?" The timestamps placed these queries just 2 days before the murders. On her social media accounts, she had posted smiling selfies with the Mitchell children, moments of affection that, in hindsight, felt unbearably sinister. The duality of it all was hard to comprehend. The doting aunt who played superheroes with her nephews, and the young woman quietly researching how to kill them. Detectives began consulting behavioral experts, trying to understand what could drive a teenager to such a calculated act. The emerging theory was as complex as it was disturbing: jealousy, obsession, and a growing resentment toward Sophia, who had become a maternal figure Ashley both idolized and envied. In interviews, friends described Ashley as attached to Sophia, someone who talked about her constantly, almost possessively. Over time, that attachment had twisted into something darker, a feeling of exclusion from the family's happiness, a belief that Sophia had taken her brother's love away. What had once been admiration had evolved into quiet hatred, festering beneath a surface of politeness and smiles. As these revelations emerged, detectives began staging a careful strategy. They knew confronting Ashley too early could risk pushing her into deeper denial, but waiting too long might allow her to build an alternative narrative. So they worked methodically, stacking evidence like bricks in a wall, unshakable, undeniable. When they brought her back for another round of questioning, They played her own voice back to her. The 317 phone call to David. Each tremble, each pause, each carefully chosen word was dissected in real time. "You didn't sound shocked," Detective Cooper observed softly. "You sounded calm. You sounded prepared." For the first time, Ashley looked directly at him. Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. The tears stopped. Her breathing steadied. "You think you know everything?" she said quietly. "You don't." Then she folded her arms, leaned back, and fell into silence. It was the silence investigators feared most, not the silence of trauma, but the silence of calculation. From that moment on, she never again cried in front of police. Outside the confines of the interrogation room, Charleston was beginning to awaken to the unthinkable. The community that had once rallied around Ashley as a grieving relative was now turning inward, whispering questions no one wanted to voice. Could it really be her? Could a 17-year-old girl, someone raised in the same quiet streets, part of the same church choir, known to the same neighbors, truly commit such monstrous acts? For David, that question was too painful to confront. He still clung to disbelief, even as detectives began to brief him privately about their findings. When they told him Ashley's fingerprints were on the gun, his face went pale, then blank. "That's impossible," he said. "She loved them." But the evidence didn't love anyone. It spoke coldly, consistently, without bias. There had been no intruder, no shadowy figure breaking in from the night. The killer had walked in through the back door in daylight, been welcomed by the victims, and left without a trace, except for the truth that would soon catch up to her. As Detective Cooper left the precinct that night, he turned to his partner and said quietly, "She didn't just kill them. She wanted to erase them. And now she's trying to erase the story." The intruder that Charleston once feared had vanished, replaced by a more haunting realization. The danger had come from within their own home. Long before the headlines and the flashing police lights, Ashley Callison was known simply as David's little sister, a quiet girl who lingered in the background of family photos, smiling shyly but never quite at the camera. She was the second child of a modest Charleston family, growing up in the same neat suburban neighborhoods that would later become the stage for tragedy. Friends from school described her as bright but withdrawn, the kind of teenager who kept to herself and seemed comfortable being overlooked. David was 7 years older, practically an adult by the time Ashley hit middle school. And in many ways, she saw him less as a brother and more as a figure to chase. Someone successful, stable, and everything she wasn't. Their parents had struggled financially, working long hours, and leaving David to watch his younger sister through much of her childhood. He'd been protective, patient, and at times, the only constant presence in her life. That bond, so natural in childhood, would later twist into something else, something neither of them could have predicted. When David met Sophia, everything began to shift. Ashley was just 10 at the time, old enough to feel change, but too young to understand it. Sophia was gentle, kind, immediately warm to the girl who would one day become her sister-in-law. For a while, the bond between them seemed pure. Sophia helped with homework, took her shopping, and encouraged her to believe she was capable of anything. But underneath the surface, a subtle storm was building. David's attention, the anchor of Ashley's world, was now shared, then slowly redirected. He was building a life with Sophia, one filled with love and purpose, a life Ashley wasn't part of. By the time she reached her teenage years, that small sense of displacement had turned into resentment, not open hostility, that wasn't Ashley's way, but a quiet bitterness, a feeling of being replaced in the one relationship that had defined her world. Family members later recalled moments when her jealousy peeked through, cutting remarks masked as jokes, sudden coldness toward Sophia during holidays, or an overprotective attitude toward David that made others uncomfortable. Nobody saw it as dangerous then, just teenage moodiness, a phase. But in hindsight, it was something much darker forming beneath the surface. When the Mitchell boys were born, Ashley's resentment deepened into something she couldn't articulate. At first, she adored them. There are photos of her cradling Liam as a baby, her face lit up with genuine affection. But over time, that affection grew complicated. To her, those boys represented everything she didn't have: family, belonging, unconditional love, all centered around Sophia. She would watch David with his sons, his easy laughter, the way he looked at his wife, and though she smiled outwardly, inside she felt invisible again. At 17, Ashley was at a crossroads most teenagers face, struggling with identity, direction, and a deep fear of insignificance. But instead of seeking independence, she clung tighter to the very thing that was slipping away: her brother's attention. When Sophia became the emotional center of David's world, Ashley began to rewrite the story in her mind. To her, Sophia wasn't just family. She was competition. In private messages later recovered by investigators, Ashley referred to Sophia as the reason he doesn't need me anymore. The words were short, careless maybe, but they revealed a dangerous clarity. In Ashley's mind, love wasn't something to share. It was something to possess. Psychologists later brought in to analyze her writings described Ashley as emotionally fixated, a teenager trapped in a child's worldview, unable to process rejection without turning it into betrayal. Her school life reflected that instability. Teachers described her as intelligent but volatile, prone to sudden emotional shifts that left classmates unsettled. Her social circle was small, mostly online, and her posts revealed a gradual descent into isolation. Cryptic song lyrics, late-night rants about being forgotten, and, increasingly, darker imagery about control and loss. One message she wrote to a friend weeks before the murders read simply, "Some people only learn to miss you when you're gone. Maybe that's the only way to make them see you." It was brushed off at the time as teenage dramatics, but for investigators later reviewing her digital footprint, that sentence became a chilling foreshadowing of intent. To Ashley, visibility, being seen, being noticed, had become an obsession. And the family she loved most had, in her mind, erased her completely. What began as a sister's longing to belong had evolved into a dangerous need to reclaim what she believed was stolen. By the beginning of 2022, those closest to Ashley began noticing subtle changes, small enough to dismiss at first, but clear in hindsight. Her friend said she had grown distant, quieter than usual, but when she did speak, there was an edge in her tone that hadn't been there before. She had dropped out of several extracurriculars, spent more time alone in her room, and had begun skipping school without explanation. When her mother asked what was wrong, Ashley brushed it off, saying she was tired of pretending to be okay. Yet no one imagined what that really meant. At home, she oscillated between affection and detachment, some days laughing with her mother over dinner, other days locking herself in her room for hours, refusing to talk. Her grades began to slip, her search history filled with psychology articles, true crime forums, and gun tutorials disguised among normal browsing. To an outsider, it looked like the typical turbulence of adolescence. But to those who saw her up close, there was something deeper. A sense that she was spiraling inward, losing touch with the world beyond her own resentment. Sophia, unaware of the storm building behind those quiet eyes, continued treating Ashley with kindness. She invited her over for dinners, asked her to babysit, and went out of her way to include her in family traditions. When Ashley posted photos of the boys on social media, Sophia would comment with hearts or, "They love their Aunt Ashley." Friends later said Sophia had confided once that she worried Ashley was lonely. "She needs purpose," she had said. "She just needs to feel needed." It was a statement made with genuine compassion, and one that tragically gave Ashley more access, more proximity, and more opportunity than anyone realized. Every visit deepened the illusion of trust. Every babysitting session gave her a closer look at the family routine. When David left for work, where Sophia kept the safe, how she moved through her day. In Ashley's mind, the more she watched, the more the lines blurred. She began journaling obsessively, filling notebook pages with strange, fragmented thoughts, some sad, some angry, others disturbingly lucid. Investigators would later find those journals tucked beneath her bed, their pages soaked in teenage emotion, but threaded with something much darker. One line, circled twice in red ink, read, "If she's gone, he'll see me again." The weeks leading up to the murders were a period of eerie calm. To family and neighbors, Ashley seemed lighter, more composed. She even offered to help Sophia plan Liam's birthday that spring. "She was cheerful," one friend recalled, "smiling more than usual. I thought she was doing better." But beneath that calm exterior was resolve. She had rehearsed the act of normalcy, played the role convincingly enough that no one questioned her sudden interest in visiting the house more often. The morning of March 14th began like any other. Sophia texting friends about errands, David heading to work, and Ashley sending a brief message to her mother. "I might stop by David's later." It was a sentence that at the time meant nothing. But when she walked into that house at 2:15 p.m., she was already carrying the knowledge of what she intended to do. There was no argument, no struggle, no warning. The decision had been made long before the first shot was fired. In the aftermath, investigators and psychologists struggled to define what had driven her. Was it rage, obsession, or something even more unclassifiable? The answer, they concluded, was all of them. Ashley had become trapped in a delusion where she saw herself as both victim and avenger. The forgotten sister, reclaiming what she believed was rightfully hers. Every smile, every family photo, every moment of joy between David and Sophia had, in her fractured perception, become proof of betrayal. It was as if she believed she could rewrite the family dynamic by erasing the pieces that didn't fit her story. In her journals, she described moments of clarity and guilt side by side. "I love them," one entry read, followed by, "but they'll never love me enough." She ended one final note days before the killings with a haunting sentence that investigators would never forget. "It has to end so I can begin again." The words were simple, but their meaning was devastating. The tragedy that unfolded in the Mitchell home was not a burst of sudden violence. It was the final act in a story that had been quietly unraveling for years. The turning point in the investigation came when science began to speak louder than emotion. Detectives had theories, instincts, suspicions, but what they needed was proof. Forensic evidence, unlike people, doesn't hesitate or second-guess. It tells the story exactly as it happened. Inside the Charleston Police Crime Lab, technicians began the meticulous process of reconstructing the final moments inside the Mitchell home. They examined blood patterns, bullet trajectories, and DNA traces invisible to the naked eye. The 9mm handgun found on the coffee table became the focal point, not just as a weapon, but as a witness. Gunshot residue tests on its handle revealed traces consistent with prolonged handling, not the brief, instinctive grip of someone firing in panic. Each spent shell casing recovered from the living room floor was carefully matched to that single firearm. Then came the partial fingerprints, faint, incomplete, but distinctive enough to point back to Ashley Callison. The smudges on the metal surface aligned perfectly with her right thumb and index finger. It was the first irrefutable link between the teenager and the murders. The weapon, the prints, and the residue together formed a story no one wanted to believe. The family's own gun had been turned against them by one of their own. But it wasn't just the weapon that spoke. It was the house itself. Every inch of that home, once filled with laughter, became evidence. Crime scene reconstructionists noted that there were no signs of forced entry, not even a scratched lock or broken hinge. The back door, through which Ashley claimed an intruder had entered, bore no prints other than her own. The positioning of the victims revealed precision, not randomness. Sophia was killed where she sat without turning, which meant she trusted whoever was behind her. Liam's body was found mid-stride, frozen in flight, suggesting he saw what was happening, perhaps the flash of the gun, or the sight of someone he loved pointing it. Noah's tiny body, crouched behind the armchair, broke every heart that entered the room. The shot that killed him was fired downward, execution style, from less than 3 feet away. That single detail shattered the panic narrative completely. No intruder would take time to aim like that. This was control, calm, deliberate control, and whoever wielded that gun had not come to rob or threaten. They had come to end. Meanwhile, digital forensics filled in the gaps between shots. Ashley's phone, the one she had insisted she left in her car, told a story all its own. The GPS log showed her stationary at the Mitchell home for nearly 50 minutes, despite her claim that she ran straight out. Even more damning were the deleted text drafts recovered by analysts. At 3:09 p.m., just minutes before she called David, she had typed but never sent a message that read, "I think something happened to them. I heard shots. I don't know what to do." That pre-written text, time-stamped before her supposed discovery, revealed chilling premeditation. She had planned the narrative of an intruder before anyone even knew there was a crime. Investigators also discovered that her phone had accessed Google Maps immediately after the murders, searching for Charleston Police Department and how long it takes for police to respond to 911 calls. These were not the actions of someone panicking in shock. They were the actions of someone checking how much time they had before their story began to unravel. When detectives presented these findings to Ashley's mother, she sat motionless, staring at the stack of printed evidence laid before her. The photographs, the timestamps, the fingerprints, all of it converging into a truth too horrific to speak aloud. "She couldn't have done this," she whispered, shaking her head. But her voice lacked conviction. Every parent wants to believe their child is incapable of evil. Yet here, the facts had no empathy. Detective Cooper, who had spent weeks dissecting Ashley's behavior, didn't gloat or press her. Instead, he spoke with quiet sorrow. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we're not guessing anymore. We're following the evidence." And the evidence was relentless. It told of a girl who had learned how to open a gun safe, who stood behind a mother and 2 children she claimed to love, and who pulled the trigger 3 times before composing herself enough to call their father with a fabricated story. In Cooper's words, "The house told us everything. We just had to listen." The case that once seemed clouded by grief and confusion was now becoming painfully clear. The truth, though unbearable, had finally begun to speak for itself. As the investigation reached its most critical phase, the Charleston Police Department began reconstructing the timeline of March 14th down to the minute. The story unfolded like a film reel. Every text, every movement, every click of a door latch mapped against the physical evidence. At 2:15 p.m., Ashley's red hatchback pulled into the Mitchell driveway. At 2:43, Sophia sent her final video to David, capturing the boys playing. At 2:46, a faint noise resembling gunfire was picked up on a neighbor's outdoor camera. 3 sharp cracks, spaced seconds apart. Between 2:47 and 3:10, Ashley's phone showed no outgoing activity, no movement, just silence. Then at 3:17, her call to David came through. By 3:28, police were on scene. The timeline fit together with haunting precision. There were no missing moments, no external variables, no mysterious figures entering or leaving. Only one person's presence remained constant throughout those 45 minutes. Ashley's. Detectives pieced it all together in a final timeline board, red string connecting photographs of the victims, digital readouts, and printed text messages. When it was done, there was no ambiguity left. The truth was clear, horrifying, and undeniable. In the lab, more forensic data confirmed what logic had already made plain. Gunshot residue on Ashley's sleeves matched residue found on the trigger guard of the weapon. Trace fibers from her sweatshirt were recovered on the living room carpet near Sophia's body, consistent with the shooter's proximity at the time of discharge. The bullet casings bore microscopic firing pin marks, identical to test rounds fired from the recovered handgun. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion, that this was not an accident, not a crime of passion or confusion, but an act of calm execution. The meticulousness of the act struck even seasoned investigators as chilling. "She didn't run," one technician said quietly during a briefing. "She stayed long enough to clean the gun and place it back on the table." There was something almost ritualistic about it, as if she wanted the weapon to be found, as though it were her way of saying, "Look at what I've done. See me now." That phrase, "see me now," echoed through her journals, her deleted notes, her social media posts. What had begun as a teenage plea for attention had transformed into an assertion of control through destruction. While the physical evidence told one side of the story, the psychological analysis began to reveal the other. Court-appointed evaluators described Ashley as emotionally underdeveloped, but intellectually aware, capable of understanding right from wrong, and deliberate in her actions. She exhibited what one psychologist termed a fixation with emotional ownership, a pathological need to control relationships and attention through drastic measures. In their report, they wrote that Ashley's resentment toward Sophia was not impulsive. It had been nurtured over years of silent envy and dependency. When David built his own family, she interpreted it as betrayal. When Sophia extended kindness, she mistook it for pity. And when the boys were born, she saw them not as nephews, but as rivals for affection. It was this distorted perception that culminated in violence. During interviews, Ashley's emotional responses swung between apathy and deflection. Asked if she regretted what had happened, she reportedly said, "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted things to stop." It was a statement that sent a shiver through the courtroom months later. Stop what? No one could quite say. With every report, every test result, and every expert opinion, the puzzle was complete. By the end of the 5th week, Detective Cooper's team had assembled an evidence file that spanned hundreds of pages. Digital footprints, forensic reports, ballistic analysis, and psychological evaluations, all aligning perfectly. There were no contradictions, no gaps to exploit, no mystery intruder to chase. It was all her. When Cooper sat in his office that final night, reviewing the case before sending it to the district attorney, he paused on one image, a still frame from Sophia's final video. 2 little boys smiling, unaware of what was coming. Their laughter frozen in a single captured moment. It was that image, he later said, that reminded him why he pursued the truth so relentlessly, no matter how painful. The evidence had spoken, and it had spoken for them. The next step would be confrontation, the arrest that would shatter what remained of the Callison family and force David Mitchell to face the unthinkable. That the person he had once sworn to protect was the same one who destroyed everything he loved. The interrogation room was small, square, and silent, the kind of place where truth has nowhere left to hide. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, the hum breaking the stillness that seemed to press against the glass. Across from Detective Ryan Cooper sat 17-year-old Ashley Callison, wrists resting on the metal table, her expression calm but unreadable. The soft sound of a recording device clicked on, marking the beginning of the session that would determine everything. It had been 5 weeks since the murders, and the weight of the case was now fully pointed toward her. Cooper had been waiting for this moment. Not to provoke, not to accuse too soon, but to watch, to listen. Ashley's mother sat in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale and drawn. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with dread and denial. When Cooper spoke, his voice was measured. "Ashley," he began, "we've gone through the evidence. We've reconstructed the day minute by minute. We just want to hear your side." For a long time, she said nothing. She just stared at the tabletop, eyes unfocused, as if weighing every possible version of reality before deciding which one to choose. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost childlike. "You think I did it?" she said. Cooper didn't answer. He simply let the silence stretch. In interrogations, silence is its own kind of truth serum. "Everyone thinks I did," she added, her tone shifting, firmer now. "But you don't understand how she treated me." It was the first time she referred to Sophia by name, and even then it came laced with resentment. Cooper watched carefully. "Tell me," he said, "how did she treat you?" Ashley leaned back, her chair creaking softly. "She wanted me gone," she whispered. "She made him forget me." For a moment, the words hung in the air, fragile and venomous at once. It was as though she were confessing not to a crime, but to a wound that had never healed. She spoke in fragments, about being left out of family trips, about Sophia taking over her brother's life, about feeling invisible. Her mother began to cry quietly in the corner, but Ashley didn't look at her. "He was mine before he was hers," she said suddenly, her voice tightening. "And she knew that." Cooper let the words linger. It wasn't a confession, not directly, but it was something close, an opening into a mind where love and possession had become indistinguishable. Detectives had already read her journals, but hearing her speak made the writings feel even more haunting. Those notebooks, lined, floral-covered, some pages torn, had been found tucked neatly under her mattress, each filled with an unsettling mixture of teenage melodrama and eerie self-awareness. Most entries were ordinary, notes about school, doodles, poems about loneliness. But scattered between them were darker lines that felt like glimpses into an unraveling psyche. "She smiles like she knows she won," one passage read. Another, "When I close my eyes, I see her face and hear them laughing." It never stops. The most disturbing entry was dated 2 nights before the murders. In careful, deliberate handwriting, she wrote, "If I take away what she loves, maybe he'll see what he lost." When forensic analysts matched the ink to a pen found in her car, it cemented the timeline of premeditation. During questioning, Cooper read that line aloud. For the first time in hours, Ashley flinched. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered. "I was angry. People write stupid things when they're angry." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She wasn't just defending her words, she was defending the twisted logic behind them. Outside that interrogation room, detectives watched through the one-way glass, exchanging glances as Cooper pressed on. "You said you didn't mean it," he said gently. "But you went to the house that day. You knew they were home. You took the gun." Ashley's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I just wanted to talk," she muttered. "I didn't plan—" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late that she had said plan. Cooper leaned forward. "Didn't plan what, Ashley?" he asked softly. Her eyes flickered, darting from him to the recorder, then back to her hands. "It doesn't matter," she said finally, her voice collapsing into a whisper. "It's done." For Cooper, that was the closest thing to a confession he'd get that day. When she was escorted from the room, her mother reached out to touch her arm, but Ashley pulled away, muttering something under her breath no one could quite hear. Behind her, Cooper sat motionless, staring at the chair she'd just left. "Behind closed doors," he later said in an interview. "You could feel the darkness in her. It wasn't rage anymore, it was emptiness, like something inside her had already shut down." In the days that followed her final interrogation, Ashley Callison was transferred from the Charleston Police Department's juvenile holding unit to a secure psychiatric facility for evaluation. The room was sterile, white, and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm of attention brewing outside. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, neighbors whispered about the sweet girl they once knew, and the entire city seemed frozen between disbelief and outrage. Inside, Ashley spent most hours staring at the wall, refusing to eat, refusing to talk. When she did speak, it was only to the nurse who brought her meals, and even then, her words drifted between lucidity and delusion. "They're still there," she said one morning, eyes fixed on nothing. "They're waiting for me to come home." Her detached tone chilled everyone in the room. It wasn't guilt, it was detachment, as if she'd compartmentalized the event into some unreachable corner of her mind. Psychologists called it dissociative withdrawal, a coping mechanism often seen in individuals whose actions conflict so violently with their sense of self that the brain begins to split reality apart. In Ashley's case, that split had become an abyss. The court-appointed forensic psychologist, Dr. Elaine Mercer, spent over 30 hours interviewing her across 2 weeks. Mercer was known for her calm persistence, the ability to draw truth from silence without confrontation. She began with questions about Ashley's childhood, her relationship with David, her memories of Sophia. At first, Ashley spoke mechanically, describing her brother as kind, her sister-in-law as nice enough. But as sessions went on, her tone changed. She described Sophia's voice as too soft, her smile as too perfect, her laughter as fake. Mercer noted these phrases, not because of their content, but because of their repetition. It was as though Ashley had built an entire identity around opposition to Sophia, defining herself through rejection. When Mercer finally asked, "Did you ever think about hurting her before that day?" Ashley went silent for nearly a full minute. Then, with startling calm, she said, "It wasn't supposed to be like that. I just wanted her gone." The phrasing struck Mercer deeply. Not gone as in dead, but gone as in erased, removed, like deleting a photo or crossing out a word. Ashley didn't speak of killing with malice. She spoke of it as correction, an act of emotional equilibrium. Dr. Mercer's final report painted a portrait both chilling and tragic. It described a girl of average intelligence, but with profound emotional immaturity, suffering from borderline personality traits and obsessive attachment tendencies. The report emphasized that Ashley understood the consequences of her actions, meaning she could stand trial, but her motives stemmed from a distorted need to reclaim identity and control. Her sense of belonging, Mercer wrote, was intertwined with her brother's validation. The introduction of Sophia and the children fractured that dependency, and Ashley's psyche responded not with acceptance, but annihilation. The word annihilation appeared 3 times in the report. Mercer explained it later in court. Ashley didn't want to kill for revenge. She wanted to kill to exist, because in her mind, she no longer did. It was one of the rare instances where science and sorrow merged, where understanding the why brought no comfort, only deeper grief. The report concluded that Ashley exhibited emotional coldness and fragmented empathy, traits more aligned with sociopathic patterns than adolescent impulsivity. Outside the sterile walls of evaluation, the rest of the world began to move again. News outlets broadcast clips of her arrest, showing the teenager led in handcuffs, eyes blank, hair falling into her face. Social media erupted in outrage, disbelief, and speculation. Some demanded justice without mercy. Others, disturbed by her youth, called for psychiatric rehabilitation. David Mitchell, her brother, remained silent. He didn't attend the early hearings. Friends said he couldn't bring himself to face her. the sister who once followed him around as a little girl, now accused of destroying his entire life. The phrase "behind closed doors" became a refrain in the media, a symbol of how something so horrifying could hide behind the ordinary. Sunday dinners, family photos, birthday cards. Inside those walls had lived love, jealousy, resentment, and ultimately, ruin. Detective Cooper said it best in an interview years later. "You think monsters announce themselves. They don't. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table and smile." For Ashley, the walls of her room became her only world, and the silence within them, the only thing she couldn't escape. The morning of Ashley Callison's arrest was eerily quiet. It was late April, 6 weeks after the murders, and Charleston had begun to settle into the uneasy rhythm of recovery. The flowers left outside the Mitchell home had started to wilt, their colors fading under the early spring sun, but the air still carried the heaviness of what had been lost. At 9:02 a.m., 3 unmarked cars rolled down the street toward the Callison residence. Neighbors peeked from their windows, sensing something final in the way the vehicles parked. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. Inside the house, Ashley sat on the couch wearing a pale sweatshirt and holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her mother stood behind her, trembling. The detectives entered quietly, not with sirens or shouts, but with the weary gravity of people who had done this too many times before. Detective Ryan Cooper was among them. He approached slowly, badge visible, voice steady. "Ashley Callison," he said, "you're under arrest for the murders of Sophia Mitchell, Liam Mitchell, and Noah Mitchell." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, without a word, she set the cup down, held out her wrists, and whispered, "I knew you'd come." It was neither defiance nor surrender, just the sound of inevitability. News of the arrest spread through Charleston within minutes. Television crews descended on the street, the soft click of camera shutters echoing across the otherwise still neighborhood. Headlines flooded social media: "Teen arrested in family triple homicide." Comment sections filled with shock and anger, disbelief and pity. People who had once described Ashley as polite, quiet, and sweet now struggled to reconcile that image with the accusation before them. At Ashley's high school, teachers canceled classes as students gathered in clusters, whispering fragments of rumor. She confessed, she didn't cry, they found her journals. To them, it was surreal, like something torn from the pages of a thriller rather than their own lives. Across town, in a small temporary apartment, David Mitchell watched the news in silence. The screen showed his sister's face, the same face that had smiled beside him in countless family photos. The same face that now represented the end of everything he'd ever loved. When reporters later asked if he'd been surprised by the arrest, he said only, "I stopped being surprised the day I buried them." It was the only public statement he would make for months. At the police station, Ashley was booked and processed like any other suspect, though the moment carried a gravity far beyond procedure. As cameras flashed from the hallway, she kept her head down, her expression blank. When the fingerprint technician asked her to press her hands to the ink pad, she hesitated, then murmured, "I've done this before." The officer looked up, confused. "When?" he asked. Ashley gave a faint, bitter smile. "At school," she said. "Science class." It was a strange, detached response, as though her mind floated somewhere far from the reality of her situation. Later, when the mugshot was released, the public fixated on her expression. Not angry, not sad, not frightened, but hollow. The face of a child who had already stepped too far into darkness to find her way back. The sheriff's office released a brief statement confirming her arrest and noting that she was being charged as an adult due to the severity and premeditation of the crimes. "Justice," it read simply, "will be sought to its fullest extent." Yet for those who had loved the victims, the word justice felt empty, almost insulting. How could a courtroom verdict fill the space left behind by laughter that would never return? Outside the courthouse, people gathered for hours, holding candles and signs that read, "For Sophia, for the boys, and for the truth." Reporters interviewed tearful neighbors who spoke of the Mitchell family in the past tense, their voices trembling as they recalled the children's laughter echoing down the street. One woman said softly, "It's like the sun doesn't feel the same here anymore." And in many ways, she was right. The neighborhood had changed, its innocence shattered, its silence now heavy with memory. The Callison home, meanwhile, became a symbol of unanswered questions. How could love twist so violently? How could a family fracture so completely without anyone noticing the cracks? Detective Cooper, in his report that night, wrote one line that captured what everyone was feeling. "We didn't just lose 3 lives, we lost 4. For though Ashley still breathed, still walked, still existed within walls of concrete and steel, the girl she once was, the sister, the aunt, the child, was gone forever." The arraignment took place 3 days after Ashley's arrest. The courtroom was packed, a sea of murmured disbelief and flashing cameras. On one side sat members of the Mitchell family, their faces tight with grief. On the other, a small handful of supporters from Ashley's school who still couldn't reconcile the quiet girl they'd known with the accusations printed in black and white. When she was led in, shackled at the wrists and ankles, the room fell into a silence so deep it seemed to absorb the air itself. Dressed in an oversized orange jumpsuit, Ashley looked smaller than she ever had, fragile, almost weightless. The judge read the charges aloud. 3 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying the potential for life imprisonment. Ashley stood motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the judge's bench, as though she were listening to a story that didn't concern her. When asked to enter a plea, her public defender spoke softly. "Not guilty." A collective murmur rippled through the room. David Mitchell wasn't present that day, but his absence was louder than any word spoken. His attorney released a brief statement on his behalf. "My client is in mourning. He has lost his wife, his children, and now, in many ways, his sister." The pre-trial months were relentless. Every piece of evidence became a headline, every leaked photograph, a weapon in the court of public opinion. Local news anchors debated whether Ashley was a cold-blooded killer or a mentally broken child. Commentators dissected her every gesture, the way she looked down during hearings, the way she flinched when Sophia's name was mentioned. Her defense team began building a case around diminished capacity, citing her psychological evaluations and emotional instability. The prosecution countered with cold precision, arguing premeditation and deliberation, armed with the digital and forensic evidence that left little doubt. The 2 narratives clashed like storm fronts, one seeking understanding, the other demanding retribution. For the public, the question was less about what she had done and more about why. And yet, the more experts tried to explain her motives, the more the answers slipped through their fingers. How do you quantify jealousy? How do you measure the weight of a mind that collapses under its own longing? For every headline shouting "monster," there was another asking, "victim?" In truth, she was neither and both, a child who had committed an adult's atrocity. David eventually appeared at one of the later hearings. He entered quietly, dressed in black, his face hollow, his eyes red-rimmed. When he looked at Ashley for the first time since the arrest, the room seemed to freeze. She lifted her head slowly, meeting his gaze. For a moment, neither moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "I'm sorry." The bailiff, not realizing she'd spoken, reached for her arm to guide her back to her seat, but David heard. Witnesses said he closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking as though the air itself were too heavy to bear. He didn't respond, didn't nod or speak. He simply stood and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the echo of that broken apology hanging in the stillness. Outside, cameras swarmed him, microphones thrust forward, questions fired like bullets. "Do you forgive her?" What will you do now? He didn't answer. Later, through a friend, he issued a statement. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I just don't know which one hurts more. Those words became a headline, then a quote, then part of the tragedy's mythology. The story of a man torn between love, loss, and an impossible truth. As summer settled over Charleston, the case began to move toward trial. The city that had once whispered now seemed exhausted by its own grief. The Mitchell house remained sealed, its windows covered, the once vibrant garden overgrown. People crossed the street rather than walk past it. For Detective Cooper, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Justice in process, but peace still far away. In an interview later that year, he reflected quietly, "You can't arrest grief. You can't put it on trial. You just learn to live next to it." And that was what Charleston tried to do. Live next to its grief. Live beside the shadows of what had happened. For David, there would be no normal. Every morning began with silence that felt heavier than the last. And for Ashley, confined to a cell barely large enough to pace, time had stopped altogether. She wrote no letters, received no visitors. The girl who once longed to be seen was now unseen by everyone, except by the memory of what she had done, replaying endlessly behind closed eyes. The trial of Ashley Callison began on a gray October morning, nearly 7 months after the murders. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, their voices rising in rehearsed solemnity as they spoke into cameras. The words, "The Charleston family murders," echoing through television screens across the country. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Wooden benches overflowed with spectators, family members, journalists, and locals who had come simply to witness the unthinkable play out in real time. The air was thick with anticipation, grief, and a strange collective disbelief. Seated at the defense table, Ashley looked impossibly young, her hair tied back, her expression detached. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, only a plain white blouse that made her appear ghost-like under the harsh fluorescent lights. Across the room, the prosecution prepared its opening statement, a timeline of tragedy laid out like a blueprint of destruction. "This was not an accident," the prosecutor began, his voice calm but cutting. "This was a deliberate act by someone who wanted control. Control over love, control over attention, control over life itself." The jury listened, eyes fixed on the teenager who sat motionless, the very embodiment of contradiction. Fragile, yet responsible for something unimaginably cruel. When it was the defense's turn, their tone was quieter, almost pleading. They did not deny that Ashley had been in the house. They did not dispute the evidence. Instead, they painted her as a broken child caught in a storm of emotional instability and psychological illness. Her attorney spoke gently, his voice low. "She is not a monster," he said. "She is a 17-year-old girl whose mind fractured under the weight of loneliness and rejection." He gestured toward her, and for a moment even the courtroom seemed to soften, because it was impossible to look at her and not see the youth that had been swallowed by darkness. But then came the reminder, the photographs. Projected onto a screen were the images no one could bear to see. The living room where the murders took place, the toys scattered across the floor, the tiny handprint smudged on the coffee table. The room fell silent except for the quiet sobbing of a juror in the front row. Ashley kept her eyes down, but her face betrayed something. Not tears, not guilt exactly, but recognition. It was as if she were seeing, for the first time, the physical echo of what she had done. The contrast between innocence and horror was unbearable. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically, day after day, piece by piece. Forensic experts described the evidence with clinical precision. The fingerprints, the gunshot residue, the phone data that erased any claim of innocence. Detectives recounted their interviews, explaining how her story changed over time, how lies became cracks that eventually split wide open. One moment that struck the courtroom deeply was when Detective Ryan Cooper took the stand. He spoke quietly, deliberately, the exhaustion in his voice palpable. "I've seen a lot of things in my career," he said, "but I've never seen a case where the motive was so simple and so tragic. She didn't want money, she didn't want revenge, she just wanted to be noticed." His words lingered in the air, heavy and devastating. The jury leaned forward, faces drawn, the weight of understanding pressing down. In that moment, the case ceased to be about evidence and became a study in human fragility, how love, when twisted by obsession, could destroy everything it touched. When the prosecution played Sophia's final video, the one she'd sent to David minutes before her death, the courtroom cracked open emotionally. The sound of the children's laughter filled the room, light and unguarded, piercing through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. For 30 seconds, the world before the crime came alive again. David, seated in the front row, buried his face in his hands, unable to look. Jurors wiped tears discreetly, some openly weeping. Even the judge paused before signaling for the next piece of evidence. It was no longer just a case. It was a memorial, a reminder of what had been taken. And when the screen went dark, that silence returned. The kind of silence that follows only after unbearable truth. The prosecutor stood, letting the emptiness speak for itself before saying softly, "That was the last sound those children ever made." There was nothing more to add. The image of that happy, fleeting moment now belonged to everyone in the room, a collective wound carved deep enough to never heal. The defense began its portion of the trial with quiet desperation. Their strategy was not to deny, but to humanize, to convince the jury that what happened was not born of pure evil, but of a mind unraveling under unbearable emotional strain. They called psychologists, teachers, and even family friends to testify about Ashley's past. One teacher described her as a bright but lonely girl, recalling how she often stayed behind after class just to talk. Another spoke of her deep need for validation, how praise seemed to lift her like sunlight through clouds. These testimonies painted a picture of fragility, of a child who had never truly learned how to belong. But against the backdrop of what she had done, those details felt like fragile threads trying to hold back an avalanche. The defense's final witness was Dr. Elaine Mercer, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Ashley. Her testimony was clinical, yet compassionate. "Ashley did not act out of hatred," she said. "She acted out of delusion, a delusion that removing Sophia would restore her world." The courtroom was silent. Even those who despised what Ashley had done couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity. Yet pity is not absolution, and the law does not heal with sympathy. Then came the day no one was ready for: David Mitchell's testimony. When he entered the courtroom, all movement seemed to stop. He walked slowly, shoulders slumped, the weight of loss etched into every step. Taking the stand, he kept his eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecutor's first question was gentle. "Mr. Mitchell, can you tell the jury about your family?" David swallowed hard before answering, his voice trembling but clear. "Sophia was my heart," he said softly. "My boys were my reason to breathe." He paused, his hands shaking slightly. "And Ashley?" He hesitated, the word catching in his throat. "She was my little sister. I loved her more than I can explain. I still do." The courtroom held its breath. Even Ashley looked up, her expression cracking for the first time since the trial began. Tears welled in her eyes as David continued. "There's not a day that passes that I don't ask myself what I missed, what I didn't see. I thought she was just lonely. I thought love could fix it." His voice broke, and for the first time, the man who had carried his grief in silence let it spill into the open. "But love couldn't fix this. Nothing can." His words echoed in the stillness. A brother mourning not one family, but two. Closing arguments came like thunder after a long storm. The prosecution stood tall, voice unwavering, painting a portrait of deliberate cruelty cloaked in innocence. This was not a mistake, the prosecutor said. It was a choice made with calculation and intent, and 3 innocent lives paid the price. He walked before the jury, letting the silence between each sentence do its own work. You have heard her words. You have seen her actions. She wanted to be seen. Now the world is watching. When the defense rose for their final plea, the tone shifted to something more fragile, almost mournful. Ashley Callison is guilty of something beyond the law's language, her attorney said quietly. She is guilty of being broken, of losing herself so completely that she took others with her. You can condemn her, but understand, she was not born this way. His voice cracked, and for a brief, flickering second, the humanity of it all overwhelmed the divide between guilt and grief. The jury sat motionless, absorbing both versions of truth, justice and tragedy, cause and consequence, and understanding, perhaps, that this case was all of them intertwined. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The air in the courtroom was electric, the kind of silence that feels alive, pulsing with dread and inevitability. Ashley was led back in, her hands trembling now for the first time. She glanced briefly at her brother, who did not meet her eyes. The foreperson stood unfolding the paper in her hands. On the charge of first-degree murder, she read, we find the defendant, Ashley Callison, guilty. The word hung in the air like a bell tolling over a graveyard. There was no sound from Ashley, no outburst or collapse, just a quiet exhale, as if she had been waiting for that word all along. David closed his eyes, his body rigid, a single tear escaping down his face. The judge's voice broke through the stillness, sentencing her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, the machinery of justice turning as it always does. But in that moment, no one felt victory, only loss. 3 lives gone, 1 forever ruined, and a family broken beyond repair. As Ashley was led away, she turned once more toward her brother and whispered, "Tell them I'm sorry." He didn't respond. He couldn't, because some words come too late and some wounds never stop bleeding. Prison swallowed Ashley Callison whole. The clang of iron doors, the fluorescent lights that never dimmed, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing down narrow corridors. All of it became her new world. The media frenzy that had defined her trial faded with time, replaced by the steady hum of life continuing elsewhere, without her. She was transferred to the South Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, a place where youth and age collided in shared despair. At 17, she was the youngest inmate in her block, too old for the juvenile wing, too infamous for general population. Guards described her as quiet, obedient, and detached. She spent most of her time in the library or in her cell, where she kept a small notebook that she wrote in obsessively. The entries, reviewed periodically by staff, were strange, fragmented thoughts, half-formed prayers, and lines that drifted between remorse and denial. "They don't talk to me anymore," one entry read. "Maybe they've forgiven me." Another said, "If I close my eyes, I can still see them smiling. That's worse than forgetting." The institution became her universe, and time, once something she used to plan her life, became something she simply endured. David Mitchell, meanwhile, disappeared from public life almost entirely. After the verdict, he sold the family home and moved out of Charleston, settling in a small coastal town where no one recognized his name. Friends described him as a man suspended between grief and survival, existing in a rhythm of routine, work, solitude, and silence. He never remarried. He didn't attend counseling or join survivor groups. He simply lived day by day, haunted by echoes of laughter that would never return. Every year on March 14th, he would visit the memorial park built in honor of Sophia and the boys. He never stayed long, just long enough to trace their names on the marble plaque with his fingers, his eyes distant and unfocused. Locals who occasionally recognized him respected his privacy. They said he carried sadness like a shadow that followed him everywhere. In one rare interview, years later, he said softly, "People say time heals, but that's not true. Time just teaches you how to live around the pain." His words became the quiet truth for everyone who had known the Mitchell family. That grief doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. For Charleston, the tragedy became part of its collective memory, a story told in whispers rather than headlines. The Mitchell home remained empty for years, a silent monument to everything that had gone wrong behind its once cheerful walls. Children avoided riding their bikes past it. Neighbors still crossed the street when walking their dogs. Some said they occasionally saw lights flicker inside late at night, though no one ever went near enough to check. The case was studied in criminology courses, discussed in psychology forums, dissected on true crime documentaries. Yet for those who had lived through it, it wasn't a case, but a scar. Detective Ryan Cooper retired 3 years after the verdict, his last day marked not by celebration, but by a quiet drive to the cemetery where Sophia and the boys were buried. He placed a single white rose at their graves and whispered, "I kept my promise." Then he left without looking back. His colleagues said that case took something from him, not his professionalism, but his peace. Some cases, he'd said once, don't end when the file closes. They just echo. Inside her cell, Ashley aged quietly. Years blurred together until time became meaningless. The girl who once sought attention now lived in near total invisibility. Inmates who had once whispered about her crime eventually stopped caring. New stories, new tragedies took her place. She took up painting through the prison's rehabilitation program, small, dark canvases of faces without eyes, houses without doors. One counselor described her art as grief without direction. Another said it felt like she was trying to paint her way out of herself. Occasionally, she received letters from strangers, from religious groups, from people who claimed to understand her loneliness. She rarely replied. The only letter she wrote consistently was one she never sent, addressed to David. Over the years, she filled pages with apologies she couldn't speak aloud. "You were the only person who ever loved me, and I broke it," she wrote in one. In another, "If I could undo time, I'd give them my life for theirs." Each letter ended the same way. "I'm sorry." Whether David ever received any of them remained uncertain, but perhaps it didn't matter. The words existed, even if forgiveness never did. By her mid-20s, Ashley Callison had faded into anonymity within the walls that confined her. She followed the same pattern each day, waking before dawn, writing for hours, eating alone, and walking slow laps in the courtyard during the brief hours of light. Her face, once youthful and soft, had hardened into something older than her years. Guards said she rarely spoke except to say, "Thank you." In the quiet, she became a ghost of her former self, drifting between repentance and resignation. Her art evolved from dark, abstract shapes into softer landscapes, skies without sun, oceans without waves, endless horizons that never reached a shore. Psychologists who visited her for periodic evaluations said she no longer displayed anger or defiance. Instead, she carried an aura of quiet surrender. "She exists," one of them wrote in her file, "but she no longer participates." Inmates who passed her in the hall would sometimes whisper that she smiled at nothing, as if replaying a life only she could still see. Time, it seemed, had done what the law could not. It had turned punishment into solitude, and solitude into oblivion. It wasn't until nearly a decade after her conviction that David Mitchell finally agreed to visit her. The request had come through the Department of Corrections every year, and every year he ignored it. But on the 10th anniversary of the murders, something shifted. He drove 3 hours to the facility, signed the paperwork with shaking hands, and sat in the sterile visiting room where the walls hummed faintly with fluorescent light. When Ashley entered, escorted by a guard, she froze. For a moment, neither spoke. The years had changed them both. David looked older, his hair flecked with gray, his eyes tired but steady. Ashley, thinner now, approached hesitantly, her voice trembling. "You came," she whispered. David nodded, but his face betrayed no emotion. For nearly 5 minutes, there was only silence. Then she said the words that had been written 1,000 times in her unsent letters. "I'm sorry." David stared at her, the same blank expression he'd worn the day of the verdict, then quietly said, "You didn't just take them. You took yourself too." She broke down, sobbing for the first time in years, her voice cracking as she tried to explain the inexplicable. But David didn't ask for explanations. After a few minutes, he stood up. "I needed to see if there was anything left of you," he said. "Now I know there isn't." And with that, he turned and walked away. That was the last time the two ever saw each other. David never returned, and Ashley never asked again. She spent her remaining years in quiet routine, her health declining slowly. Prison officials noted that she withdrew even further into isolation, rarely participating in programs or speaking to counselors. In 2039, at the age of 31, she was found unresponsive in her cell. The cause of death was ruled suicide. A small vial of hoarded medication, a note written in the same careful handwriting that once filled her journals. It was brief, almost childlike. "I'm going home now." There were no family members left to claim the body. The state cremated her remains and buried the ashes in an unmarked plot behind the correctional facility, where the grass grew uneven and the wind carried only silence. When news of her death reached Charleston, it barely made the papers, a short column tucked between local news stories, summarizing her crimes in 2 paragraphs. But for those who remembered, it reopened a wound that had never fully healed. David, living quietly by the coast, heard the news from a retired detective who had stayed in touch. He didn't respond at first, just nodded, thanked him, and went on with his day. That evening, he drove to the small memorial park where Sophia and the boys' names were carved into marble, the same place he visited every year. He sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air thick with salt and memory. For the first time in years, he spoke aloud. "It's over," he said softly. "All of it." Whether he meant the pain or the story, even he couldn't say. Some say he stayed there until the stars came out, his silhouette still and quiet against the fading light. The tragedy that had begun with love and ended in devastation had finally come full circle, not with justice or forgiveness, but with exhaustion. Charleston moved on, as all cities do, though the memory lingered like a faint scar on its history. And in that small cemetery by the sea, where the names of the lost shimmered under the morning dew, the wind seemed to whisper what none of them could ever truly say, that even in the darkest hearts, there had once been love, and that was the saddest truth of all. For years after the murders, the story of the Mitchell family became a quiet legend in Charleston, one not spoken of often but never fully forgotten. Teachers, neighbors, and churchgoers still remembered the family's laughter, the way Sophia's boys would race down the sidewalk with toy cars clutched in their hands, their mother calling after them with gentle patience. Their home, though long sold and repainted, carried a weight that no renovation could erase. People said you could feel it, that strange, unspoken heaviness that clings to places where something beautiful was broken. True crime documentaries and podcasts would occasionally resurrect the case, narrating the events with somber tones and haunting music. But for those who had lived through it, it wasn't a story. It was a memory stitched into the fabric of their lives. The Mitchell tragedy, as locals came to call it, became less about the violence itself and more about what it revealed. The fragile line between love and obsession, between care and control, between needing someone and consuming them. It was a line that no one had seen until it was already too late. Detective Ryan Cooper, long retired, was occasionally asked to speak at universities about the investigation. He never showed photos. He never spoke of blood or evidence. Instead, he talked about the danger of blindness, the way people see what they want to see until the truth becomes unbearable. Monsters don't always hide under beds, he told one class quietly. Sometimes they sit across from you at dinner, smiling, hurting, and you don't even notice. His words carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. He told his students that the case had changed him, that it had taught him how easily love could turn inward, suffocating the very people it was meant to protect. After each lecture, he would leave in silence, declining interviews or follow-ups. Once, a student asked him what he remembered most about the case. He paused for a long time before answering, "The sound of her brother's voice when he realized it was her. That sound never leaves you." For Cooper, and for many in law enforcement who had worked the case, the lesson wasn't about evidence or justice. It was about humanity's quiet, terrifying capacity for self-destruction. The small park, built in honor of Sophia, Liam, and Noah, became a place of reflection, not mourning. Each spring, the city planted flowers along the path leading to a small stone fountain engraved with their names. Children played there again, their laughter filling the air, a sound once silenced, now reclaimed. Every year on the anniversary of their deaths, candles lined the path, their flickering light blending with the hum of crickets and distant church bells. Some came to pray, others just to sit in silence. There was no ceremony, no speeches, only quiet remembrance. Among them was David Mitchell, who continued his annual visits well into old age. He never brought flowers, only a small toy car that he would set gently by the fountain's edge before walking away. To those who saw him, he was just an old man honoring a promise. But to him, those moments were all that remained of the life he'd lost. The echo of his children's laughter, the warmth of Sophia's smile, and the reminder that love, however fragile, had once existed there. In the years following Ashley's death, psychologists and criminologists used her case in lectures, not to sensationalize, but to understand. Her story became a reference point in discussions of family dynamics, adolescent psychopathy, and emotional isolation. Students debated whether her actions stemmed from nature or neglect, trauma or pathology. But what struck most scholars wasn't the crime itself. It was how ordinary her life had seemed before it all unraveled. There were no warning sirens, no violent history, no red flags that screamed catastrophe. Just a girl who smiled politely, who blended into crowds, who loved too much and too destructively. One professor described it perfectly. The Ashley Callison case reminds us that evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, the kind that grows in silence until it finally speaks in tragedy. The story continued to ripple outward, through classrooms, documentaries, and dinner table conversations, a chilling parable about love, loss, and the shadows that linger in even the brightest homes. Years turned into decades, and Charleston changed. New homes, new families, new children running along the same sidewalks that once echoed with loss. Yet, in subtle ways, the past remained. The older residents still spoke of the Mitchells with a tenderness that never dulled. Some remembered Sophia's warmth, others recalled the boys' laughter, their small sneakers thudding against the pavement as they raced toward their mother's open arms. The park fountain, once a memorial, now just part of the city's rhythm, still bore their names. Over time, the letters wore smooth from the touch of countless hands, strangers who didn't know the story but sensed its weight. On quiet evenings, when the air grew still and the church bells rang across the bay, some swore you could hear children laughing faintly in the distance, a sound not of haunting, but of memory. Charleston had learned to coexist with its ghosts. The city didn't speak of the tragedy anymore, but it carried it, gently, quietly, as part of its soul. David Mitchell lived to see the city rebuild itself. He never remarried, never sought attention, and never gave another interview. He lived a simple life by the sea, surrounded by silence that felt less like punishment and more like surrender. The years softened him, not with forgiveness, but with fatigue. Friends who visited said he still kept 3 framed photos on his mantel, one of Sophia, one of Liam and Noah, and one of a little girl in pigtails, Ashley before the world turned dark. When asked why he kept her picture, he would answer softly, "Because once she was part of us." To him, the tragedy had never been about good and evil, guilt and innocence. It was about love, twisted and broken until it destroyed itself. On his final visit to the memorial park, he sat for a long time beneath the willow tree near the fountain, watching the sunlight dance on the water. Then, quietly, he whispered something no one could hear, stood, and walked away for the last time. He passed away a few weeks later in his sleep, leaving behind no public statement, no will beyond a handwritten note that read, "They're together now. Let them rest." After his death, a small service was held at the same cemetery where Sophia and the boys were buried. There was no media, no spectacle, just a handful of people who had known him, standing beneath the shade of that old willow tree. As his ashes were placed beside the family he had lost, the wind stirred gently through the branches, carrying with it the scent of salt and jasmine from the nearby coast. One of the detectives who had worked the case years earlier attended quietly from a distance. He later said it felt like something final had settled that day. Not closure, but stillness. The kind that follows after years of storm. The Callison name faded from headlines. The Mitchell home became just another address, and the city that had once grieved now lived without flinching at the mention of it. Time had not erased the tragedy, but it had dulled its edges, leaving behind only echoes, soft, distant, and enduring. In the end, the story of the Mitchells and Ashley Callison became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror. It reflected the fragility of human love, the danger of loneliness left unchecked, and the way silence can build walls around the soul until all that's left inside is shadow. For Charleston, it was a wound that healed unevenly, leaving behind both pain and perspective. For those who heard the story years later, it became a lesson, not about violence, but about the quiet desperation that can grow unseen behind closed doors. Somewhere, deep in the archives of the Charleston Police Department, the case file still sits on a shelf, its cover faded, its pages yellowed with time. Written across the front in bold black ink are just 4 words, Mitchell Family Homicide Case. But beyond those pages, beyond the evidence and transcripts, lives something far greater, the memory of innocence, the echo of laughter, and the unspoken truth that love, when lost or twisted, can destroy as deeply as it once healed. And as the final light fades from the story, what remains isn't horror or blame, it's silence. The kind that comes when the world has finally learned to remember without breaking. In the end, it wasn't the violence that haunted Charleston. It was the silence that came before, the silence that followed, and the silence that still lingers in the spaces between memory and forgetting. The Mitchells were more than the story that defined their deaths. They were laughter, they were love, they were life, fragile, fleeting, and real. And Ashley Callison, she was not a monster born, but a mirror cracked beyond repair. Her story reminds us that sometimes the darkest places aren't found in the world outside, but in the hearts of those who feel unseen. The house is gone now, rebuilt, repainted, reborn. But some echoes never fade. They travel through time, whispering caution into quiet homes, reminding us to listen a little closer, to notice the ones who fall silent too soon. Because every tragedy begins as something ordinary. A smile, a promise, a moment you think will last forever. And then, it doesn't. This is not just the story of how a family died. It's the story of how love, unspoken and misunderstood, can destroy, and how even in its ashes, remembrance keeps the light alive.